This is Iowa Talking Points, the candidates, produced by Studio 5 at Mud Advertising, Totally Iowa Media, and News Talk 1540 KXCL, where you hear from the candidates in contested races in the June 2026 Iowa primary election. Now, Iowa Talking Points, the candidates. From Studio 5 at Mud and Cedar Falls, here is Jeff Stein.
Hello and welcome. There will be a new member of Congress representing Northeast Iowa's 2nd Congressional District in Washington come January of 2027. It's an open seat due to the incumbent seeking other office. There are 2 Republicans seeking their party's nomination to be on that November general election ballot, and one of them joins us at the Iowa Talking Points table today. He is Joe Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is a Republican. JoeMitchell.com is his website. He is a builder and a developer and a former member of the Iowa House of Representatives. Joe Mitchell, thanks so much for taking time.
Jeff, good to be here.
So what led you to make this run? Obviously, when we're talking about electoral politics, there are dominoes that start to fall and openings become available. But why did you decide this was your time?
Well, Jeff, I love this country. And as you just noted, I'm a builder. I'm a small business owner. I'm a proud Iowan. Born and raised here in Iowa. I'm 20 years old. I feel like I'm 50 sometimes, but I served in the legislature. I worked for President Trump. I was the chief of staff to the Federal Housing Finance Agency last year. And also, like I said, I've built homes all across the state, in Grinnell and Dyersville and Mount Pleasant, Clear Lake, where I live. And so I see what's happening, and the average age of a first-time home buyer is 40 years old. And to achieve the American dream, we know something: you have to be able to afford a home. And if you can't afford a home, you can't start a family. And so we're focused on unleashing the American dream, making sure that we're cutting regulations and taxes for working class families to make sure that they can achieve their American dream and do better than their parents.
What sort of building and development did you focus on? And in full transparency, that's how we first became acquainted.
Correct.
I did a radio interview with you about your role with a builders association. What sort of communities or developments did you focus on?
So I build workforce housing communities all across the state. And so these are neighborhoods that I'm building twin homes, 4-plex, 6-plexes, single family attached homes. That, again, are typically more affordable than your single-family home. And so we're building homes that the average person, the everyday person in Iowa can afford. And so I've been doing that since 2020. I've built, developments in Mount Pleasant, Southeast Iowa. I've built stuff in Grinnell and Dyersville and Clear Lake. And so we've built all around the state. And I started something called the Iowa Real Estate Developers Association. And so that's where we first got acquainted. And I started that organization in 2022. So I served in the legislature for 4 years, but I started this trade association because we didn't have an association to advocate on behalf of our industry. And as you know, every single profession and trade and industry has a trade association that represents their interests at the state capitol. Developers, for whatever reason, did not. And you have to make sure to keep home cost affordable, that you're cutting regulations, that you're making sure that there's, a favorable, tax code for people to be able to build and people to be able to buy homes. And so that's what we've been focused on over the last, 4 years with that association. But, a lot of my life has been, dedicated and, it's been, about building these homes and making, Iowans' life more affordable.
And you're still engaged in business. I think I made it sound like past tense, but you're still working.
Every day. Yeah. I mean, this morning I was on the phone with, contractors, and I'm still the guy showing up to city council meetings and getting things rezoned and getting the permits to be able to build things. And so very much, still an active business owner, and I will be in Congress as well. And so, we're excited about be able to go to Congress and be somebody that actually has real world experience. And something that's interesting, when I went to DC a few months ago, I asked the home builders, I asked the apartment association, the realtors, I said, is there a developer in Congress? And they said, there's not a single developer in Congress. And so you don't have anybody in Congress that's been a home builder, that's been a developer, that's actually, built real things. And I think, that's been to the detriment of DC. And when you don't have people that have went out there and built businesses like I have, I think that can become an issue.
So you mentioned it's difficult for especially younger people, to afford that first home, or I assume for folks to afford better homes, bigger homes, etc. What is causing that in 2026? Is it a different cycle than what we've had before? Are there dynamics at work that make this a unique time?
Well, the cost of homes went up by 50% between 2020 and 2025, which is quite the hike. And a lot of that was due to, COVID and the money supply. Regulations have a lot to do with that as well. And, interest rates have went up. And so, ultimately, this is where, you used to have, for many decades, between 1970 and 2000, the average age of a first-time home buyer was between 28 years old and 30 years old. And, that seems about right. That's when people have had a job for a number of years, when they get married and then they start a family and they have kids. And, that is hiked, to 40 years old over the last 20 years because of the regulatory burden, because of, inflation, in the economy. And so, these are things that are all direct repercussions of, Washington, D.C. politicians and bureaucrats adding cost to housing and making it harder for everyday Americans to be able to afford a home.
So what's the answer from a congressional standpoint? If Congressman Mitchell gets a chance to introduce a bill or lobby fellow lawmakers, how do you fix the problem?
Well, you have to incentivize the states, because we have a lot of money that go to the states for LIHTC and other programs to provide housing for people. And you have to incentivize the states to have a more basic building code and energy code. And what you had under Joe Biden and the Democrats for 4 years is they were doing the exact opposite. They said that the energy code had to be up to these super high standards, where it was really just Green New Deal garbage that was in there, making things cost more, adding $20,000 to $30,000 per unit additional cost from the installation that you had to install. If you had apartment buildings, you had to put EV chargers in. So a bunch of nonsense regulation and red tape that was put in place. And I think we need to do the exact opposite and say, hey, we're not going to give you money from the federal government unless you have a common sense building code and energy code that is affordable for builders to be able to build homes that work for everyday people.
What about mortgage rates? Are those where they should be? And if not, what's the cause of that? Because again, with many of these problems, and I keep coming back to what could you as a congressman do, there are certain things that are outside the scope of the federal government. But diagnose the problem first of all.
Well, this is where, the interest rate has to continue to come down, and the 10-year Treasury, dictates, what your 30-year mortgage is. And, how we do that, in a few different ways. Number one, you have to get control of spending. The president's also going to have Kevin Warsh, who is nominated to be the Fed chair. And I think Kevin's going to do a fantastic job. I think, he's going to, probably ask the Board of Governors to do several rate cuts, before, next year, which I think is a good take, and I think is going to be, helpful for the American people. But interest rates have came down under President Trump. They were record highs under Joe Biden. And I think the president's focused on that. I know he was last year when I was, at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And so, you need to get interest rates below 6%, closer to 5% before I think you see the housing market move the direction and have the momentum that we wanted to have. But ultimately, it's a combination of things between interest rates, regulation, and tax incentives for both buyers and builders.
And again, anything broadly that Congress can do that keeps more money in the pocket of a 28 to 30-year-old,
correct,
that's a help as well.
Correct. And this is where the big beautiful bill was so important, because you've seen tax cuts go to working class people. And so you had no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on Social Security. So you had, tax cuts that, by, the Democrats' definition wasn't for, just business owners and wealthy people. It was for working class people. And so I think that's important, because that's who we need to be helping out is, your everyday person here in, Cedar Falls or elsewhere around the district. And that's what we're focused on, and that's the policies that we're going to champion in Congress.
He's Joe Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is a Republican running for the nomination of his party Congress District Number 2, which is Northeast Iowa. JoeMitchell.com is the website. We'll find out a little more about his background and what he would do if he goes to Washington. That's as Iowa Talking Points continues in a moment.
All the great news talk programs you love from KXEL on your radio can be with you wherever you go.
I'm Todd Starnes.
This is Mark Levin.
I'm Tim Harwood.
Bill O'Reilly here.
I'm Kim Commando.
Hey, it's Glenn Beck.
I'm Jeff Stein.
Just download the free KXEL mobile app. You can find us in the App Store or Google Play. Make sure you never miss a second of the conversation. Download the KXEL app today. It's a great way to stay connected to where Iowa comes to talk.
One opportunity. Change your career. Mudd Advertising is hiring product specialists. $20 an hour, paid weekly. That's 52 weeks a year, plus record-breaking profit sharing. Let me repeat, $20 an hour plus record-breaking profit sharing. But we're just getting started. The best in the business, 401k, company match, gold standard health plans, on-site fitness center, generous paid time off, and so much more. Apply today and don't look back.
You're watching Iowa Talking Points, the candidates. Here again is Jeff Stein.
And we continue the conversation now with Joe Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is a Republican. He is seeking the nomination of his party in the 2nd Congressional District, that's Northeast Iowa. JoeMitchell.com is the website. You mentioned that you were in the Iowa legislature for 4 years and you were a member of the Trump administration, but you also mentioned you're 28 years of age.
Correct.
So you had to decide at an early age that you wanted to be involved in public service in some way. What spurred that?
So, Jeff, I started as a page at the state capitol when I was 17. You know, I was always somebody, growing up in grade school that was interested in, government, history, and politics. And I grew up in a household of, 2 parents that were small business owners. And so they complained a lot about taxation and they watched a lot of Fox News, And so, naturally was interested in, government class. And I had a teacher in high school, Ann Weir, my English teacher, who suggested, how about you apply for the PAGE program at the Iowa State Capitol? And so I did that and I got accepted. And that was back in 2015. And I just fell in love with the process and really learned there that, your state legislature dictates so many different things that can happen in your life. And no matter what field you're in, no matter what industry you're in, there's permitting, there's regulation, there's compliance. In the state legislature, DC or local officials, they have something to do with that. So it taught me from an early age how important, civic education is and being involved with your government in the electoral process. And so I went to Drake University then after that, continued to work at the Capitol as a clerk in the state Senate, and then as an intern in Governor Reynolds' office. And then my seat, which has been occupied by Dave Heaton for 24 years, he's my predecessor. Dave decided to retire and made that announcement. And that was in 2018. And I decided to throw my hat in the ring. And had a 4-way primary and knocked on a lot of doors. Was not supposed to win that primary, but I did because I went out there and I put in the shoe leather. I talked to voters. I asked them for their vote, and I said, I'm a young guy, but I want to represent the next generation up here at the state capitol, and stand for what we believe in here in Iowa. And so the people gave me their their vote. And, got elected, and that was in June of 2018 when I won that primary, and then November won the general election. And so got sworn into the Iowa House at 21 and, served 2 terms and really enjoyed my time there. But, again, it took a lot of hard work and talking to voters and door knocking and putting in that hard work that, what it takes to win an election.
So you were working in Washington for the Trump administration when this seat became an open seat. What's the thought process that says, I want to leave this job in Washington for a president that I support in an area, development and building that I know a lot about? That's not an easy call.
Well, it was a risk. And, we still have to win this primary, of course, on June 2nd. I think we will. I'm confident in that. But ultimately, the decision to actually run for the seat came because I said Congress passes all these laws and all these regulations I'm talking about are in statute for the most part. There's only so many things that the administration, the executive branch can do. And we have to have reform from a congressional standpoint. Congress never goes back and fixes anything that they've done wrong, any of the problems that they've caused. And so I said, we need to have people that understand business, understand the private sector, that can go on there, that are job creators like myself, and that have seen the other side of it, have worked in the administration, have worked in the executive branch, have also been a legislator. And so, I've been blessed again with, these different experiences as a young person, and I've done a lot. And, I actually think my, experience is probably the best out of anybody in this race. And so, that's why we decided to, announce and throw a hat in the ring for, this congressional seat. But I announced on September 8th, and, somebody that was a very close friend of mine is Charlie Kirk. We've talked about that before. And, Charlie got assassinated on September 10th. And, when he got assassinated, for me, really changed the dynamics of this race, because, he was somebody that was exercising his freedom of speech. He loved to have discussion and discourse and debate on college campus, and he got killed doing what he loved, fighting for this country and for the Constitution. And so ultimately for me, it said, we have to step up because he was a once-in-a-generation talent. And I'm not going to be able to replace him. No one will. But it takes, all the people like myself that he had mentored either directly or indirectly through his millions and millions of followers and his audience online to be able to step up and stand for, these American principles that we believe in.
You had been politically active not only in your own campaigns, but you were an organizer. You were trying to mobilize like-minded people. That's how you got on Mr. Kirk's radar, as I recall.
Right. So I met him September 10th of 2019. So 6 years ago to the date that he was shot and killed. And I met him in Des Moines, Iowa, went to an event to meet him and get my picture with him. And to my surprise, he wanted to meet afterwards and talk about how a young guy like me had gotten elected. And we sort of put this roadmap together to start a group called Run Gen Z to help young conservatives run for state and local office across this country. And so started that in 2020 and grew that for a number of years. And we've gotten hundreds of young people elected across this country to school board races and city council races and state legislative races across the country. And, so he had a huge influence in my life. And I briefly talked to him about, this race in August of last year. And he said, you got to run. We got to have a new generation of leaders that's going to represent us in Washington. And so he was the last person to see my press release on September 8th.
So, and I don't mean to be flip about this, in the wake of his assassination, there have been many people who have not been shy about trying to tout a relationship with him. You seem to not only have the goods, if you will, but right down to he's copy editing your news release. That's a very genuine relationship. Right.
Well, I'm the only person in the state that Charlie ever endorsed. He endorsed me in my state legislative races. And so, I'm, again, was, personal friends with him. And, he was all behind this race. And Turning Point, of course, has endorsed us, since then. And so we just want to carry on his legacy and make sure that people know that, that we do need to have a new generation of leaders in Washington that care about spending and taxes and our freedoms and making sure that we're promoting liberty.
And the president has weighed in on this race.
He has. So, that's the best endorsement you can possibly get is from, President Donald Trump. And so we got that back in January. We're very thankful and honored to have that endorsement. And, we had a lot of our opponents, dropped out either, before then or right around when he made that announcement. And so, it carries a lot of weight. And, people don't understand either just because you work for the guy and had caucused for him early in 2024 and raised money for him and was a delegate at the convention, but he wants to see that you're going to work. He's not just going to endorse you willy-nilly. He wants to make sure that he's going to endorse the right person that can win the race. And so we've been very proud of that endorsement, and we've been promoting it all over the district, and voters are happy that we have that as well.
So you've talked about, and this is a good place to continue the conversation, and then we'll take a break. You talked about new generation, next generation. What's different about 20-somethings, early 30-somethings, and what they want to see done as opposed to either a past generation or those who are in office now?
Well, every vote I take, I'm accountable to my peers, and it's going to affect our generation more than any other generation. And so, that's anything, again, with spending on taxation, making sure we have the, best education and healthcare systems in the world. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is that any vote we take, we're accountable for many, many years, because we're going to be the youngest person, up there when elected.
And it's interesting you say that, because when we talk about Social Security, for example, they say it'll be insolvent and the triggers of the automatic cuts will kick in, I think it's 2031, 2032. And so those who are elected this year, this cycle for U.S. Senate, we'll have to deal with it.
Correct.
The chickens come home to roost on that. When you're talking about young people who have a 30, 40-year work career ahead of them saying, we're going to not only take these votes, but we plan to be here to see them carried through.
Right. Correct. Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And that's why, a number of other things that we're running on is we're not taking any corporate PAC money. So we'll be the only Republican, when elected to Congress, not taking any corporate PAC money from Pfizer or BlackRock, Wells Fargo, John Deere. And so I think, that's been, something that both young people and, older people, both sides of the aisle, Republican, Democrat, that have been very, surprised by, pleased by. We're, an advocate for term limits. And so we've said, 12 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, that's 24 years in total. I think that's, more than enough time to get your agenda done. And then the third thing is you got to stop this insider trading. And so you have insider trading that happens, and, people go up there, they're worth about $2, and they come out, they're worth about $20 million. These people, I've met them. They're not smarter than Warren Buffett. These, traders on Wall Street, these hedge fund managers. And so, ultimately, I think the new and next generation of leaders, as our voters, they want to see, real corruption cleanup happen in Washington that hasn't happened in a long time.
Joe Mitchell is our guest here on Iowa Talking Points. We're midway through the program. Short break now. We'll continue on the other side.
One opportunity. Change your career. Mudd Advertising is hiring product specialists. $20 an hour, paid weekly. That's 52 weeks a year, plus record-breaking profit sharing. Let me repeat, $20 an hour plus record-breaking profit sharing. But we're just getting started. The best in the business: 401k, company match, gold standard health plans, on-site fitness center, generous paid time off, and so much more. Apply today and don't look back.
Watch all the programs in the Iowa Talking Points series online at iowatalkingpoints.com. Iowa Talking Points, the candidates, continues with Jeff Stein.
And we continue with Republican Joe Mitchell. He is running for Congress from Northeast Iowa's 2nd District. JoeMitchell.com is the website. And before the break, you articulated 3 basic points that you're running your campaign on. The first had to do with limiting contributions from certain sources. Tell us, A, how you came to that position, and B, how difficult is it going to be to run a full-blown campaign with that kind of limitation?
Well, Jeff, so, a number of things. When we were in the legislature, we saw this firsthand. We took corporate PAC checks, and it's a hell of a lot harder to say something about, a corporation that may or may not be doing something wrong if you took in money from them. So that's where, we made the decision very early on, not to take, that, corporate PAC money. And, for us, we've still been able to raise a record $1.4 million in the last 8 months. And so, it most certainly hasn't hurt our overall fundraising numbers. I have been told by plenty of consultants in DC that we're leaving money on the table. But for us, we have a much clearer conscience, and we have, I think, a better campaign because we're not taking that money. And so we're proud to tout that. I was on the Steve Deace show a few months back, and I was talking about this issue and named a few of the companies. And I was told by somebody in DC, they said, you don't want to name those companies because they hold a lot of weight for these committees that you want to serve on. And I said, well, I don't care. I mean, to me, you need to speak the truth. You need to be genuine and authentic. And that's what we try to be on this campaign. And so, we're going to, call out bad actors if there is, any. And trust me, there's plenty. And so, this is where, we've decided to, make that a pretty frontline issue in the campaign. And then the second thing we talked about is the term limits, and so I think this is super important. People are up there for 50 years. I'm 28. I don't want to be up there when I'm 80. And I've said, people like Senator Grassley, they do a fantastic job. If everybody was like Chuck Grassley in Washington, I wouldn't be calling for term limits. But many more are like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi than Chuck Grassley. And so this is where I think you do need to have term limits. I think I'm, pretty gracious with, 12 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, and I think that's a pretty reasonable offer. But ultimately, I think you have to stop people, from, being up there for many years, accumulating that power, and then also trading then on, insider information that they have. They get very wealthy. And so, ultimately, I think that it breeds corruption, and you've seen that, for many years in Washington. And so, we've made that decision to, not trade individual stocks. And, the other thing is that, you have to stop this legislator to lobbyist pipeline that's there. And that happens a lot too. And I think that influences people's decisions, when they're focused on their career post-Congress, which, trust me, I've had people tell me, you got to think about your career post-Congress and not to get these corporations mad at you. And I'm like, my career post-Congress is building more homes, okay? There's a reason I've never been a lobbyist, and there's a reason that, I've, not wanted to go into the government relations world. It's because, I do real things like build homes, and create jobs in our communities. And so, ultimately, I think you need to take care of those very pressing issues that have been issues for a long time to get to the root cause of the issues.
I don't think too many people listening to this conversation who are going to cast a vote in the Republican primary on June 2nd would argue with really anything that you just mentioned, but there's a lot of pressure, is there not? I mean, if you do a radio and TV show and people in Washington are cautioning you about don't say this about this company or that company, how does one member of Congress from Northeast Iowa stand up, get their agenda accomplished, but stand up in the face of that kind of pressure, which is almost baked into the system these days?
Right. Well, this is where you have to create cultural change. And it starts with one member bringing the issues up and making sure that, this is something that's popular with the voters. And voters should be asking, their members of Congress and the candidates that are running for these offices, whether or not they'll stand up to these issues as well. And so that's where I think, hopefully we're starting a trend that's going to expand, and, we'll get more members of Congress, hopefully in my freshman class, that'll come in and have a similar, idea. And trust me, I've talked to, a number of candidates that are running on the Republican side, about these issues, and, how I think it's going to be, something that's going to become even more increasingly, pertinent, over the next, few cycles.
There is a primary race. That's why we're having this conversation as part of the Iowa Talking Point series. Distinguish yourself from your opponent so that Republicans who are going to cast a ballot, they need to compare and contrast the two of you. Put some distance between you, or give us a sense of some of the things that distinguish you from him.
Well, the first thing is we show up. And, I've seen my opponent at one event in the last 4 months. And I go to events every day. We were just in Lynn County before this. We were in Fayette yesterday, in Oshawa. So we're everywhere around the district every single day. And I see candidates running for governor. I see candidates running for Senate. We see state legislative candidates, but I don't see my opponent. And so I think that's the biggest thing is you got to be able to show up to talk to the voters in any election. And, we haven't seen that from him. And then the second thing is you got to be able to raise money because, unfortunately, and we just talked about the corporate PAC money, which we're not taking. So, I am selective about the money we take. But we've had over 11,000 individual donors give to this campaign. And so that speaks to the grassroots effort and support that we have, for our campaign for Congress. And the other thing is that we just have, more experience from the private sector level, being a small business owner, signing that front of a paycheck, creating jobs, building real estate, working for the president. So, we just, I think, have a stellar record and, a resume that, I would put over anybody else, in this race. But more importantly, we show up, we talk to voters, we ask them for their vote, and we talk about the issues that, they care about.
What do they tell you most often these days? Now, we're having this conversation in April prior to a June primary, but when you go to some of these locations throughout the 2nd District, what do you hear most often from people?
Well, I think the people are thankful that President Trump is in office right now and that he's our leader. People are thankful that the border is finally closed, that we don't have an open border, and that we've cut taxes and we've cut a record amount of regulation. And that, we're going to be energy independent finally again. And so I think, people are, grateful for the leadership that he's shown in Washington. And I sure am too. And so I, think that's what I hear most often from people.
We have a few minutes more, and we'll talk about some of the things you did in Des Moines in the State House and what you might want to do in Washington if elected. He's Joe Mitchell. He's a Republican running for his party's nomination, Congress, Northeast Iowa's 2nd Congressional District. We'll continue final segment of Iowa Talking Points, the candidates, in a moment. Iowa has a wonderful heritage. And each day I'll share these stories of historic people and events with you. I'm Jeff Stein. Join me for the Iowa Almanac program and learn more about this great place we call home. Now 7 days a week. Listen on radio stations across the state, via podcast, or at iowaalmanac.com.
One opportunity. Change your career. Mud Advertising is hiring product specialists. $20 an hour, paid weekly. That's 52 weeks a year, plus record-breaking profit sharing. Let me repeat, $20 an hour plus record-breaking profit sharing. But we're just getting started. The best in the business, 401k, company match, gold standard health plans, on-site fitness center, generous paid time off, and so much more. Apply today and don't look back.
You're watching Iowa Talking Points, the candidates. Here again is Jeff Stein.
Final segment now with Joe Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell is a Republican. He's running for his party's nomination for Congress from Northeast Iowa's 2nd Congressional District. JoeMitchell.com is the website. You served 4 years in Des Moines. Give us some examples, not necessarily of pieces of legislation, unless that's helpful, but I'm thinking more of how were you able to advance what you wanted to advance, working across the aisle, building coalitions, etc. An example of some skills that you learned there that you could take to Washington.
Well, Jeff, when I was in Des Moines, we had a record amount of regulatory cuts, including one specific bill that I ran, where there's actually a gentleman here from Cedar Falls, Waterloo area, William Burt, and I don't know, you maybe have interviewed William before, but he has a mobile barbershop. And so, he's somebody that is an entrepreneur, innovator, and, he, started this mobile barbershop. And by law, you had to have a brick and mortar store to be able to have a barbershop. And, so this was a pretty simple piece of regulation, but we were able to pass a law that said you don't need to have a physical address and you could have, a mobile barbershop and, cut hair wherever you see fit and be able to drive around in different neighborhoods, different towns. And so that was a bipartisan bill that we were able to pass, and I was proud to, be the floor manager, on that bill. But we did many different pieces of legislation like that. When I was in the legislature, we passed the largest income tax cut in Iowa history, when I was the vice chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And so, we were very focused on economic growth and making sure that this state is the most, business-friendly state, in the country to be able to grow jobs and grow wages, for Iowans. And so, worked, on many different bills with Democrats, and, 90% of the legislation in the state capitol that's passed is bipartisan, which people don't typically, realize that, but a lot of times the headlines can be misleading, and, there is a lot of, good bipartisan work that's done at the state legislature.
All right, so we talked in the prior segment about what you, the candidate, would do, pledging for term limits and for restrictions on stocks, etc. What would you as a congressman do? Are there certain issues? We talked at the start of the program about the American dream and home ownership, etc. But what are some of the other issues that you really would want to have a hand in crafting policy about should you become a congressman?
Well, I would love to serve on the Ways and Means Committee again in Congress. I think that'd be a great honor. Tax policy is something that I was passionate about, in the Iowa legislature, and I will be in Congress as well. I think we need to make sure that we're passing more tax cuts for everyday working Americans, that we're passing tax cuts for small business and medium-sized businesses here in Cedar Falls that actually are going to affect people's lives and grow wages and provide people with strong benefits. And so I think to a certain extent we've been very focused as a body, as Congress in DC for many years on very large corporations, multinational corporations. And I think we need to focus on small and medium-sized businesses that do actually grow those jobs, and focus on workers and making sure that they can take up more of their pay home and be able to afford that home and or save for college or whatever they're going to do with that. So ultimately I think that I'd like to focus on ways that we can grow our economy, grow wages for the everyday American and Iowan, and that's what we'll be focused on in DC.
You're running as a Republican. What does that mean to you? I say that because each of the two major political parties seems to have factions or fragments or wings. So when you say to someone you're a Republican, what does that mean to you?
To me, that means that we're standing up for freedom and liberty. And I think, the Democrat Party has become so radical and so destructive. And, it doesn't resemble the Democrat Party my grandparents belonged to. Both sets of my grandparents were Democrats, and they were proud Democrats, and they were, JFK Democrats, and, they were a party that, stood for the working class, and that no longer is the case. I believe that the Republican Party actually, stands more with the working class people than the Democrat Party does, because we just believe in common sense. We believe in a strong border. We believe in less taxes. We believe in less regulation. We believe in a strong, national defense and national security. And the Democrats seem like they don't believe in any of those things now. The candidates themselves and the elected officials, I think there's still a lot of, great, Democrat voters out there that, believe in those ideals, in the party that, once was, but it's changed rapidly, and it's became a party of destruction. And so ultimately for me, Republicans represent common sense. They represent the Constitution. They represent freedom and liberty.
You mentioned a bit ago when we were talking about your time in Des Moines that much of the work done there is bipartisan. Well, I'm not sure that's the case now in Washington. It seems quite fragmented. And again, you have a very different balance of power, just a few votes in the majority, as opposed to in Des Moines, where you were a member of a House that had a pretty good sized Republican majority. So how do you navigate those waters when every single vote counts just to darn near call a quorum?
Right. Well, and this is where I think, the three items I've talked about on my platform with the corporate PAC money, the term limits, the banning insider trading, those things actually have been bipartisan, it seems like. So I actually do think you can find a lot of common ground there on a lot of the anti-corruption platform that we're running on. And so, I'm looking forward to working with anybody that, is driven and is committed to, stopping, corruption in Washington on either side of the aisle, to making sure that, Congress as a whole, works for the people and not for, corporations or, other special interests.
We have just a few minutes left, and you're asking Iowans to vote for you, Republicans, in the primary on June 2nd. So I'll give you the last few minutes to speak directly to them and make that case.
Of course. Well, we have to preserve the American dream. And I talked about that earlier on the segment. We have to make sure that the average age of a first-time home buyer is no longer 40 years old. We have to allow people in my generation to be able to buy a home, start a family, have kids, and have growing wages. Wages have been stagnant for many decades now. We have to make sure that we can cut spending, cut taxes, drive up wages so you can have a better life.
It occurs to me, if you said you were 28, is this high school reunion year?
No, it's not. It was that was a few years ago.
Okay. I was going to say
that was last year, actually.
I was going to say
2025.
Showing up for your 10-year reunion as a candidate for Congress. That
right.
Probably
I just missed it. Yeah. So
that beats my reunion is this year, and it's many more years than yours. Joe Mitchell, thank you so much for the informative conversation and coming to the Iowa Talking Points table.
Thank you, Jeff.
Joe Mitchell is a Republican. He is running for his party's nomination from the 2nd Congressional District, that's Northeast Iowa. Again, that primary election is June 2nd, and you can learn more about his platform and his campaign online. It's joemitchell.com. And that brings us to the close of this edition of Iowa Talking Points, The Candidates. I'm Jeff Stein. Thank you for being along.
This has been Iowa Talking Points, The Candidates, produced by Studio 5 at Mud Advertising, Totally Iowa Media, and News Talk 1540 KXCL. For more information on this series, go to iowatalkingpoints.com.